You are looking at a symbol you have used today, maybe this morning, maybe an hour ago, two vertical lines through an S, the dollar sign. And one of the most widely repeated theories about where it comes from does not lead to Wall Street. It leads to a mountain in what is now Bolivia, a mountain the indigenous people who worked inside it called the mountain that eats men. Its name was Cerro Rico, discovered by Spanish colonists in 1545. Inside it, the largest deposit of silver the world had ever seen. Over the next 3 centuries, that single mountain would help bankroll the Spanish Empire, flood Europe and Asia with coin, and by many historians' estimates, though the exact number is genuinely disputed, cost the lives of several million indigenous and enslaved African laborers who were forced into its shafts. You will hear that number again before this video ends. Hold on to it. Because the mountain is not a footnote. It is the middle of a pattern that starts with a harmless trade voyage and ends, 400 years later, underneath your own hands, on a screen, on a coin, on a battery. This is the story of how European colonization of the Americas began as a business plan, became an extraction machine, and is, in one very literal sense, still running today. Picture this. Spain and Portugal, late 1400s. Europe wants spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and the routes to get them run through Ottoman-controlled territory, expensive and slow. So European monarchs start funding an alternative. Sail west, reach Asia by going around the world instead of through it. It is framed at first as a shipping problem, a logistics problem. Nothing about discovering or conquering a new continent is in the pitch, because nobody funding it believes one is there. In August 1492, an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus leaves Spain with 3 ships and a royal contract that promises him a cut of whatever wealth he finds, plus the title of governor over any land he claims. That contract matters. Remember it. A man was financially incentivized, in writing, before he ever saw land, to bring something valuable home by whatever means necessary. The 12th of October, 1492. Land in the Bahamas. Columbus meets the Taíno people, and in his own journal, a real surviving document, he describes them as gentle, generous, and lacking in weapons. He writes, in paraphrase, that they would make good servants. That single observation, recorded within days of first contact, is the innocent beginning curdling in real time. It is worth naming the man Columbus put in charge on the ground. His brother, Bartholomew Columbus, and later the colonial administrators who followed him on the island of Hispaniola, needed labor to extract gold. So they built a system. Indigenous communities were assigned to Spanish colonists, required to deliver a quota of gold or goods, and if they failed, punishment, mutilation, death. It would later be formalized into law as the encomienda system. It was a small decision that was not small at all. A quota system built to move gold that treated an entire population as a renewable resource. Remember that word, encomienda. This pattern will repeat, under different names, for the next 500 years. By the way, before we go further, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and it genuinely changes how I think about which stories to tell next. Also, hit subscribe if this kind of deep dive is your thing, because we're only at the beginning of this one. Now the numbers, because this is where the story stops being abstract. Historians still argue fiercely over how many people lived in the Americas. Before 1492, estimates range from a few million to over 100 million, depending on the region and method. What is far less disputed is the collapse that followed. On Hispaniola alone, within roughly 50 years of Columbus's arrival, the Taíno population is estimated to have fallen by well over 90%. Some of that was violence. Far more of it was disease, smallpox, measles, influenza illnesses indigenous immune systems had never encountered, spreading faster than any army could march. Here is one person, out of millions. We don't know her name. Almost none of them were recorded. But Spanish accounts from Hispaniola in the early 1500s describe Taino mothers faced with forced labor quotas and starvation, choosing not to bring children into that world at all. Colonial chroniclers noted falling birth rates as a puzzle. It was not a puzzle. It was a verdict on the world they had just built. The gold on Hispaniola ran out fast, so the Spanish crown looked for the next deposit and found it in 1545 in that mountain we opened with, Cerro Rico, near the new city of Potosí. Within decades, Potosí was one of the largest cities on Earth, bigger than London or Madrid at the time. Its wealth funded churches, wars, palaces 4,000 miles away. The labor system that fed it had a name too, the mita, a rotational forced labor draft adapted from an Incan practice and weaponized by Spanish administrators. Indigenous men from surrounding provinces were conscripted, for months at a time, to work the mines. Conditions were brutal enough that many families reportedly held funeral rites for conscripted relatives before they even left, because the chance of return was that low. Before I tell you the reveal, guess in the comments, how many tons of silver do you think left that single mountain for Spain over 3 centuries? I'll give you the number a little later. Keep watching. By the mid-1500s, some Spanish clergy were horrified enough to write home about it. A Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas, who had lived in the colonies and initially profited from the encomienda system himself, became its loudest critic. In a widely read account published in 1542, he documented in detail historians still cite today the scale of indigenous death under Spanish rule, and argued it amounted to a moral catastrophe. His writing reached the Spanish court, and in 1542, King Charles V issued the New Laws, formally banning the enslavement of indigenous people and moving to phase out the encomienda system. Case closed, or so it was supposed to be. Colonial landowners in the Americas revolted, sometimes literally, against enforcement. Within a few years, the new laws were watered down, delayed, and in practice widely ignored across much of the empire. And here's the part that turns reform into relocation instead of solution. As pressure mounted against indigenous forced labor, colonial economies didn't shrink their demand for unpaid work. They redirected it toward the transatlantic slave trade. Over the following 3 centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. Roughly 10.7 million are estimated to have survived the crossing. The system did not end. It found a new labor source and a new supply chain. Quick and honest, if you want more of these long-form breakdowns to actually reach people instead of disappearing into the algorithm, a like is genuinely the only signal that tells the platform to show this to more viewers. Takes 1 second. Back to it. Now here's where I want you to lean in, because this is not a back then story. Fast forward almost 500 years, same region, practically the same mountain range. Beneath the salt flats of Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, an area now nicknamed the Lithium Triangle, sits an estimated majority of the world's known lithium reserves, the metal that powers electric vehicle batteries and phone batteries alike. Global demand for it has surged as the world electrifies. And the extraction, once again, runs directly through indigenous land communities whose water rights and traditional livelihoods are, according to multiple environmental and indigenous rights researchers, being strained by the enormous volumes of water lithium brine extraction requires in one of the driest regions on Earth. This is an area where figures shift quickly as new mining projects are approved, worth verifying the latest numbers before you publish, or before you assume this one. Not similar, identical, in structure. A resource the world suddenly wants badly. A remote region, rich in it. A local population with the least legal and financial power in the negotiation. A rush that arrives faster than any regulation built to slow it down. Different metal, different century, same mountain range. Same mine that once ate men, now sitting a few hundred kilometers from lithium operations, feeding the batteries in phones exactly like the one you might be holding right now. Here's your reveal, as promised. Historians estimate that over roughly 3 centuries, Cerro Rico produced enough silver to fund a large share of Spain's imperial ambitions, commonly cited at somewhere in the range of 40,000 to 60,000 tons. Though exact colonial-era accounting is imperfect and estimates vary by source, verify the specific figure before you quote it. This is one of the numbers historians still debate. And that dollar sign we opened with? One popular theory ties it to the mint mark used on Spanish colonial silver coins struck in Potosí and Mexico City, a P over an S, or the abbreviation for peso, gradually simplified by merchants into the symbol you use today. It is a theory, not a settled fact. Competing explanations exist, and you should treat it as widely repeated rather than proven. But true or not as etymology, it captures something true as history. The wealth extracted from that mountain didn't stay in the ground, and it didn't stay in the past. It became the plumbing of a global monetary system that is still, in some form, running. So where does this actually stand today? Indigenous communities across the Americas continue to report disproportionately high rates of poverty, land dispossession, and reduced access to clean water compared to national averages in their country's figures that vary significantly by country and are worth checking against current government or UN data rather than taking as fixed. Land-back movements, water rights lawsuits, and renewed scrutiny of green mining projects have grown louder in the last several years, in Bolivia, in Chile, in the United States, and Canada alike. That part is worth saying honestly. Transparency around Indigenous land rights and corporate accountability in mining has genuinely improved compared to a generation ago. International reporting standards exist now that simply didn't in 1990, let alone 1,550. That is not nothing. But improvement is not the same as resolution. The core shape of the transaction, a distant demand, a local cost, a population that didn't get a meaningful vote in the deal, has not disappeared. It has changed metals. So here's what I'll leave you with. Every time a new resource the world suddenly needs gets discovered, silver in 1545, oil in the 20th century, lithium now, the pattern asks the same question of the people who happen to be standing on top of it. It asked it of the Taino in 1493. It asked it of the men who went into Cerro Rico. It's asking it again, right now, of communities most of us will never think about, so that the rest of us can charge our phones. The question it never quite answers is this. When the world finds what it wants underneath your home, who actually gets to decide the price? If this connected to something in your own family history, your own country's history, or even just changed how you'll think about your next phone upgrade, say so in the comments. I read every one, and this is exactly the kind of story worth sharing with someone who's convinced they already know how this part of history goes. Subscribe if you want the next one, and send this to that person.